Imagine Europe in 1450. Dangers, ruled by superstition, and all governmental power was held by local warlords. Life was short as a result of famine and disease. This is hardly what someone would imagine as the beginning of the collection of countries that will come to reshape and dominate the rest of the world, both economically and militarily, for the next 500 years. The beginnings of this rise to power lay in a cultural phenomenon known as the Renaissance. The Renaissance would soon engulf all of Europe, and with it brought great change. It would galvanize a new drive for progress and learning. This boost of information, coupled with newfound desire to learn, would allow for Europeans to make advances in technology and social organization. Over the next 200 years, Europe would begin to centralize power in the nation state, put a greater emphasis on education, and begin to explore and colonize the world in an effort to gain access to cheap labor and cheap resources. This colonization by European countries ensured a steady source of cheap materials to be brought back to Europe, refined, and resold back to its colonies for much higher prices. The Europeans' method of subjugating these colonies was using their military. Europe would continue to dominate the world up until the late 18th century, when these colonies began to seek independence, and public pressure back in Europe demanded that they didn't go to war and fight these colonies and waste European lives. So the European governments decided, okay, we'll give up, we'll let you have your independence, your freedom, and allow you to flourish on your own. Only was this stranglehold held by Europe ever really released. So the modern Western and Westernized world has expanded to include both the United States and Canada, as well as Western Europe. These nations are all considered to be developed. Other nations that are not as economically successful are known as developing nations. These so-called developing nations are largely made up of ex-European colonies. So developed nations are seen as being rich, powerful world leaders, making decisions that affect the entire world for the better. Without a doubt, the West does make many decisions that affect the entire world, but they are far from altruistic. The first book I read was Prisoner of Tehran by Marina Namat. It is a memoir detailing her life as a young girl and the horrors she underwent as a political prisoner in Tehran. She would endure her imprisonment and eventually gain freedom, after which she escaped the country and emigrated to Canada. After reading this book, I was left flabbergasted as to why the other world powers, namely the West, did not get involved and protect her human rights. So with that question in mind, I went on to reread my ISU novel from last year, The Chalice of Sarajevo, by Stephen Galloway. This novel is loosely based on a true story. It details the atrocities being carried out against civilians in the streets of Sarajevo. Again, there is no action from the West or any other country to intervene. So with both these novels in mind and the inability for the West to intervene in countries, I went on to watch The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and it showed that the West seemed to care a little about the actual concentration camps. They were more concerned about their other goals, and the liberation of the concentration camps was ultimately a byproduct of these Western goals. So after seeing all these examples of Western apathy, I was left with the conclusion that the Western involvement in other countries is ultimately immoral. Now, at first you're probably thinking I'm crazy, and how did I come to this conclusion? So I'm going to go and explain that. That's the topic of my TED Talk. So think of how wasteful we are in the West. New cell phones at least once a year, always wanting new computers and other technology, while eating the best parts of fruits and vegetables, throwing out food that doesn't meet our expectations. To get little kids to do what we want, like eat their veggies and not let them toy, we commonly say, oh, they're starving children in Africa, eat your food. Now, it's a stereotype, but it sort of represents a flaw in our society, because while we live in this squalor of excess, we feel tremendous guilt for being so wasteful. So as a people, our solution for this problem is to get the government to intervene in these third world countries and developing nations to try and create positive change. So we feel better about ourselves because we've got our governments intervening and trying to help out. But really, our attempts and cry for positive intervention has been twisted by our governments into the continued exploitation of these third world countries. So the two most common manifestations of this intervention is through military intervention and economic aid. So the first area I'm going to focus on is the military intervention. So any military intervention is sending foreign soldiers into countries that the West has decided need assistance in some sort of way. Quite often this assistance is brought in because the nation is deemed unstable, the political system is going through changes, or Western interests in the area threatened. So the fundamental flaw in this policy of military intervention is that every situation is blurred and jaded, as well as a result of Western perspectives. The easiest way that it seems being moral is because the West is getting involved to protect their own interests. It's not hard to see how sending soldiers into a country simply to ensure you have access to cheap oil or your diamond mine remains open is immoral. It's even more ironic when these invaders preach freedom and equality for all. So what's free and equal about invading independent nations simply to ensure your resources remain cheap and easy to get to? And yet somehow the media in the West portrays us all as the West saving the day. So it's also immoral, this military intervention, when the West is claiming to try and stabilize a region. We see an area that may have little government or little governmental control. So the West decides to swoop in and invade these countries. They overthrow the government and replace it with a puppet government, which is loyal to the West because the West put them in power and the West continues to have economic bonds with them. And because they owe everything to the West feels it's easy to manipulate and control them, and it really is. So is it really moral to invade a country, put your own government in, and then claim that you've promoted freedom and equality for all, when really you've created a West loyal nation under the pretense of doing the moral thing? So another excuse to get involved in the developing world is when a political system is changing in one of these countries. So if there's a revolution or a rebellion, the West will quite often throw their support behind one side. This side is almost always the side that is pro-West or supports Western interests or policies in the region. So the West will either send in troops or outfit the side they support with superior weapons and or technology. So David J. Francis did work on mercenaries in Sierra Leone. He says that the West has even gone as far as to hire local mercenaries to fight for a side. So the West hides the support behind the so-called defense of human rights, or the support of freedom, and yet they're saying that they're defending human rights and freedom when the side that they're often supporting is a dictatorship or committing just as heinous acts against the people of this country. So Fatima Ibrahim did work on the refugee crisis, and she says that the public is thrilled by us intervening and somehow defending these people, when really we're just worsening the problem. The West really doesn't care whether or not people are free. They just care that their interests and resources are protected, and the new government is West friendly. Now, understand why you would disagree with this, right? Like, we only get involved in certain countries because we have to, or there's public pressure too. But the way that we pick and choose what countries we get involved in just proves that all this is accurate. It's not just an accident that we're not in Syria right now or other countries like that. So if we were getting involved in every country that had a conflict for the ideal of human rights and stabilizing the areas for the good of its people, then why don't we get involved in other countries? For example, the Gulf War, a conflict between nations in the Middle East, far removed from the West, halfway around the world, in fact. Who gets involved? The West. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, this was a relatively insignificant act. Obviously, there will be some conflict, but nothing too major. But Kuwait has a large deal of oil that the West enjoys buying. The Iraqi invasion threatened the Western supply of that oil, and thus the West came to invade Kuwait. They were claiming they were defending Kuwaiti sovereignty and the people of Kuwait from the Iraqis. Look at modern-day Syria. Still part of the Middle East, still halfway around the world, an oppressive dictatorship fighting a war against its own people who are fighting for their freedom. They use gas, they kill innocent civilians, they kill children, and yet the West just chills. We're not involved at all. We're not ignoring the problem because there's a great deal of public pressure, but the government doesn't care. It's just public pressure, right? So where is the West to champion human rights and morals and freedom now? Oh wait, that's right. There's no point in getting involved in Syria. There's nothing to be gained. So how moral is that? So the next area that I'm going to focus on is the Western intervention of giving goods and money, which is commonly called foreign aid. So foreign aid is the act of donating goods, money, or services to countries that may need them. There are two reasons why this aid is immoral. The first reason is monetary aid. Monetary aid is the giving of money to developing world countries' governments. Before I explain how this is moral, I'd like to point out how stupid it is to give money to these governments. They're often corrupt, and chances are that the money will never actually reach these people that need it the most. They'll be kept by government officials, and they'll buy themselves nice cars and nice houses and 17 wives, or however many they want. Now, as to why this donation of money is immoral, it's really a result of our Western greed. Like, sure, we're donating this money to countries to further themselves and improve, but at what cost? These loans from the West are in large part responsible for continued subjugation of developing nations. That's paraphrased from Fatima Abraham's work again. So the entire GDP of some countries which is gross domestic product, which is how much a nation makes per year, goes just to paying interest on these loans to the West. So this ensures a steady source of income for Western nations in the form of interest payments. These loans have gotten so big that they're not repayable. They struggle to make interest every year to ensure that interest payment doesn't get increased. So this ensures that this country can't put any money towards actually developing, and as a result, this lack of development creates stagnation, and this stagnation is what we capitalize on. We use these poor workers as a source of cheap labor, which is how we can drive down prices in the West, right? Our cheap clothes, cheap everything, really, is a result of, in large part, the result of these loans that these countries can't pay. Now, you guys might ask, like, why not give goods to these countries instead of money? Well, the issue of corruption and people keeping these goods for themselves is still just as prevalent as when you're giving money. But the immorality of it lays in the fact that giving these goods creates a dependency on the West for these citizens. So, like the analogy of teaching someone to fish, they can eat for a lifetime, whereas you give them the fish, they can eat for a day. This giving of goods ultimately creates a dependency on the West and perpetuates the stagnation of these countries, meaning that we can still exploit them and benefit from their poverty. So in conclusion, the immorality of Western intervention is a result of the Western government's desire to dominate the world. People of the West demand equality for all and want to see the developing world developed. Knowing this, our governments tell us they support the development of the developing world using military aid to ensure freedom, equality, and stability, and using foreign aid to help the people of these nations. The reality is that they have twisted the good intentions of the Western people and created a system by which to perpetuate the colonial experience and continue to rule the world.